Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Hello, Professor. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm fine. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much for joining me in this interview. I'm really honored to be here with you today. Professor, in this interview, we'll discuss topic related to ethics. But firstly, I would like to start from early stage in your life, your personal journey toward academic. I mean, how did it start? Did you start reading about philosophy from childhood, or it began in older age? Can you hear me? Because your
yes, I can hear you. Yeah. No, it's a good question. Can you hear
sometimes
me?
your picture is phrasing.
All right. Okay.
I'm not is my fault, and it's about my net, my internet, or about you.
Yes, I'm not sure. I think let me just see if I can close some things here and see if that will help.
You know, the voice and picture is not sync.
Right. Yes. No, well, I'm having the same problem with your picture. It's not entirely synced. So I've closed some things on my computer and I'm hoping that might help a bit. I don't know if that's any better.
Professor, if may, please join again.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Fine. I'll do that. Yeah, no problem. Hopefully that is a bit better now. I'm not sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, but again, not sync. Okay. I think that's good because we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry that the video and the audio are not, working quite correctly together. But shall we just proceed anyway? Not sure what else I can do about that at the moment. Yeah. Okay. So
I'm sorry. Excuse me. Oh, what's happened to this? That's very. Let me check something.
Okay.
Professor,
Yes, yeah,
it's
I can hear you.
okay. If you allow me, let's begin again. Now is better.
Okay, yeah.
Your picture and is better the sync. Professor,
Okay,
thank you so much for joining me in this interview. I'm really honored to be here with you today. When you accept my request to be in this interview, I'm really surprised. Thank you so much for joining me in this interview. Thank you, Professor.
Well,
okay,
thank you very much
thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Professor, in this interview, we'll discuss topic related to ethics. But firstly, I would like to start from earliest stage in your life, your personal journey toward academic. How did it start? Did you start reading about philosophy from childhood, or it began in older age? And then please tell us about the impact of childhood on your professional future. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think I do remember thinking about some philosophical questions, you know, from fairly early on in childhood. I remember my father actually at some point introducing me to the idea of the Cartesian evil demon hypothesis. I mean, I don't think he mentioned Descartes, but just, you know, the idea that you know, everything that we see might be an illusion, and just introducing the question of how you could know that that wasn't the case. You know, how could you really prove that that, you know, I mean, I don't know, in the Cartesian version, you've got, you know, you can't prove that you're not dreaming, you know, you can't prove that you're not having some hallucinations that are caused by an evil demon, or in modern versions, you've got the brain in the vat. But and I think that really hooked me as a kind of question. And I don't know. And then I suppose as I got interested in kind of political ideas and so on when I was in my teenage years, I was again kind of interested in sort of fairly foundational questions. I suppose, you know, not just the policy issues specifically, but the underlying questions of value and so on. However, I applied to university and to do my undergraduate degree in sociology, sociology with social policy. So that was very applied in a way. But then I switched to doing a philosophy degree while I was, you know, in the middle of my undergraduate degree. And I think I just liked the idea that with philosophy, it's just you and your mind trying to figure out the questions. So obviously, you know, you've got to read and try and assess other clever people who have thought about these things. But I felt that with sociology, I was having to rely on evidence and so on that were gathered by other people. I had no idea whether their evidence was well gathered and what the, you know, and so on, you know, whether I could trust it. Whereas with philosophy, it seemed like, you know, you had the resources within you already to work out whether this was a good argument that was being presented to you or not, you know, to some extent. So I suppose that fact that philosophy is done from the armchair, as people sometimes say, was something that I really quite liked. So so I don't know if that's enough of an answer to your question, but that gives you a bit of a sense of how I came to philosophy and how I got interested in it, I suppose.
Thank you so much. And when you look at your childhood and youth, what book or character has influenced you the most and made you interested in philosophy?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. I'm sure there are many of them, but one thing that I did at school was I did French. right through school. And in my final years of school, I did. We had to read Camus' book, The Plague, La Peste, and I mean, it's still a book that I really like, actually. But on a very basic level, it seemed quite philosophical. But also, I suppose the way I was reading it, it's just it's the situation of a plague invading a city, and there are doctors involved, and you've got to decide whether you're going to be involved in trying to combat the plague and fighting the oppression, or whether you're going to kind of benefit, seek to benefit from it in some way, or just let it happen, or you just had to kind of decide which side you were on in some way. And I quite liked that book for a number of reasons. I mean, one was just that it seemed to have an interesting kind of symbolism to it, and you could read this situation as having an interesting philosophical background. But then, that basic existentialist question of what are you going to do with your life, and what are the fundamental choices that you're going to make, and so on. I guess that was pretty influential. I really enjoyed getting engaged with that book, and for quite a lot of my life, I would read that book regularly every few years. So yeah, I guess that was probably quite an important one.
By the way, the picture and portrait behind you is the card. Am I right?
No, this portrait here is actually by Goya. So it's a Spanish, the Spanish artist Francisco Goya, and it's actually of one of his friends who was a judge. And I quite like, I suppose as I kind of got into working on criminal justice and so on.
Yes.
And I've always been quite ambivalent about criminal justice. I mean, that, maybe that's one thing we'll talk a bit about. But I'm quite interested in ideas of retribution and so on, but not because I'm wholeheartedly in favor of them, but just because I can't quite reject them either. So they seem like a very good basis for philosophical research. And so something about that kind of ambivalence of them, seems to be summed up in Goya's portrait of this judge. He can't quite love him and so on, but on the other hand, it's kind of respectful as well, and the person's expression also seems to be quite it seems to have that kind of ambivalence in it as well. So anyway, when I was in Spain in let's think, where was this? From the Rijksmuseum. So this was actually it's a portrait in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And so I picked up that postcard, having seen the portrait, and thought, wow, that's really quite an interesting thing being said there about this role of a judge.
I'm sorry about my question. It's a personal question. I'm real sorry.
Okay, great. Yeah.
If you allow me, before we're getting main topic, I have a question. In your opinion, what is the duty and role of philosopher in society?
Yes, I don't have an easy answer to that question. I mean, it is a very good question, of course, but I mean, so I think there's a number of things to say, and I'm not sure how they all fit together or whether they're all totally compatible. I mean, I think in one way, the role of the philosopher is to provide us with a better understanding of some of the basic ideas that that we appeal to and that we use in living our lives, and in trying to work out all sorts of practical issues, whether personal or political, and so on. So I think that is one of the important answers to your question. And I suppose, as I try and explain the value of philosophy to people who are just not interested in metaphysical questions, then, you can get them interested by saying, well, maybe you're interested in some value like transparency or accountability or justice or something. Well, those things can mean all sorts of different, those ideas can mean all sorts of different things, and you might have various different interpretations of what those are and how important they are. Well, as you get into that kind of question, you're doing some philosophy. So I think that's a kind of clear answer to, and I think, I think societies are much shallower in their understanding if they don't have people doing philosophy. But that does also mean that philosophers need to kind of get out and talk to non-philosophers and engage with them as well. So I think that's one part of the answer. But I think there is also another part of the answer, which is has more to do with the importance of, in a way, pure philosophy. So, so what I've just said is in a way, about the, as I see it, undeniable importance of a kind of applied philosophy or engaged philosophy or something like that. I mean, philosophy that takes its starting point from, problems that a person will come up against in any life or any form of politics and so on. But I think there's also clearly another role for philosophy in just taking ideas and trying to work them out in a certain kind of pure form, in a way not worrying about particular practical concerns I mean, obviously, with some of these kind of bigger metaphysical questions or more pure questions, you might also be kind of touching on the role of religion and so on. And you might say, well, that clearly does have a big personal importance as well. So, I mean, I don't think there's a clear split here. But if you're just thinking about some fairly pure questions about how it's even possible to know the world and what the world has to be like in order for it to be knowable by us and so on. I mean, these are great questions, but you can imagine someone having a fairly decent life without really having thought about those questions. But I think there are a whole range of other more engaged and applied questions where I think philosophy is necessary for you to get to the bottom of it. And you can't really imagine a decent life without someone, coming up against these ideas and finding them a bit confusing, where, philosophy could then get in and help. So, anyway, that's a bit of a complicated answer to your question. But as I see it, there are various different strands of philosophy, and the answer to the question of what's the kind of social role or duty of the philosopher just depends very much on kind of what you're thinking about. But I think that there is there's more of an engaged role for philosophy than people have necessarily given it credit for.
Thank you so much. Another question, I think it's very important today, especially today in the world, is the relationship between ethics and politics. A month ago, the world see the Putin's decision about Ukrainian, and that's awful war. I mean, what is the relationship between ethics and politics? Can a government sacrifice its foreign interests to values? Some people say this. Sometimes governments have to make decisions that are against their moral values, some people say. Please tell us about this issue.
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and I suppose we have debates about this well, going back many years, but one event in recent UK history was the advent of a Labour government in 1997. So Labour, is a left-wing party, and they came in talking about having an ethical foreign policy, where they were going to respect human rights and so on, and make that the real cornerstone of foreign policy. But I guess very quickly got enmeshed in very tricky practical questions about what the relationship between the UK and the US was going to be, for instance, and did the UK want to remain as a close ally of the US, in which case it might have to do some things that the US wanted to do and support the US. And so by the end of the Blair government, obviously we'd had the war in Iraq and so on. That was supported by a Labour government. So for a lot of people, I think that's just an incredibly uncomfortable situation, and for many people, that's unforgivable. What happened there? I mean, I suppose I think that these are just very tricky issues. I mean, I tend to think that the government, the Labour government made the wrong decisions in that case. But, they would have been giving up a lot, if they took a stand against America or refused to go along with that, just because of the personality of George W. Bush and what, how he would see the kind of support that was needed and so on, and the administration that he had around him. And you can imagine things getting even worse if it's a Trump or something like that. So I don't know, so that's just a very small example of the complexities. But yes, politics has got to be about building alliances and so on. That's clearly one of the things that you need to do in politics. But building alliances means, well, it's potentially in conflict with moral integrity. And I guess that might be true in personal life as well as in political life. I mean, my friend is, I want to retain this friendship. My friend keeps doing things that I don't really approve of and so on. And in a way, my keeping up the friendship implies that I do, I think that kind of thing is all right. So do I break the friendship off? Well, I don't know. It's not straightforward that what the right answer is. I'm not saying that there isn't a right answer. That would be too pessimistic. But anyway, I think it's very hard to give a very general answer about what the relation between ethics and politics is for that kind of reason. And then I suppose there's also just the question of what the fundamental duty of a national government is. Is it basically, is the fundamental duty security of its own people or something like that, or the well-being of its own people? And does that then, and the continuity of the state, does that then trump or take precedence over other considerations like the human rights of people outside the state and so on? I don't think so, but yes, I mean, it's these are tricky questions. And then, of course, just to throw in something else, if you've got a democratic system, then you've got to balance all of that with voters' perceptions and making yourself electable and re-electable and so on, because as the Labour Party has found in the UK, you can't do anything if you can't get elected. You just have you keep having the wrong people in government. So so there's that as well, and of course that can again take you away from the path of moral integrity, as it were. So yeah.
Yes, when you talk about America, Europe, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, I remember the question. As I live in Iran, in the last decades, America, Russia, China, Europe, and Iran is struggling with the issue nuclear weapon in Iran. When I see the issue and perspective of golden rules, that's very complicated to me, and I'm really confused because even if Iran have a nuclear weapon, why United States have Israel and a lot of country? Please tell us about this. I'm sorry, that question is not related to main topic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, obviously this is just a very tricky issue, and I wish the nuclear weapons had never been developed. Yes. And I don't think that there's ever a justification for using them, because they're so indiscriminate, and because of the way in which conflict can escalate. And obviously they're just crazy weapons to have. I don't think there's any justification for their use or for possessing them. However, once they are in existence in the world, then I think something has to be done to try and restrict their usage. And the more countries that have them, the less you're able to be certain of where they all are and so on, and who's using them and so on. So yes, I would at some level I would be in favor of disarmament. I don't think anyone should have these weapons. I doubt that that's a realistic policy objective at the moment, but I can see the point of trying to restrict the range of countries that have nuclear weapons. But yes, I can see that from the perspective of a country like Iran, or Pakistan or whoever, it might look incredibly unjust that the big countries are allowed to have nuclear weapons, and then they then have leverage over all the smaller countries, and hey, the smaller countries are not allowed to have them. So but yeah, it's not as simple as that, but I can I can understand a sense of resentment there, but I don't think the right answer is, well, let's all have nuclear weapons. Then yes. I don't think that can be the right solution either.
Okay, thank you so much for your excellent answers in this part of the interview. And now I want to share a screen with this great book. Can you see that?
Yes, I can see that. Thank you. Yes.
What is this called? What is this thing called ethics? First of all, please tell us about this book and the story behind this book.
Yeah, so so this book is a book that I wrote as a way of introducing people to ethics or moral philosophy, And I suppose in writing it, I wanted to try to do two things. To, on the one hand, make it useful for people who are doing philosophy courses or modules. So it was going to be based a bit on the kind of things that tend to be taught in universities, at least in my bit of the world. And on the other hand, I wanted to also, kind of write it in such a way that it would be open and accessible to people who weren't necessarily doing university education, but who were just interested in, trying, learning something about what ethics is and how philosophers approach it and so on. So I was trying to do two things. So write it in an engaging and a kind of accessible way, but also to not go too far from the kind of topics that I and my colleagues tend to teach, And and at least some of the material in the book is based on the lectures that I'd then, by then been giving for about 10 years on ethics topics in my university teaching.
In your book, as we see, you talk about religion and ethics. That's a very important issue for 1,000 years. In Iranian academic community, the relationship between ethics and religion is very important because we live in Iran, and Iran is a religious country. Some people say religion based on morality, and some say ethics based on religion. Please tell us about this relationship.
Yes. So what I do in the book is really to kind of assess one answer to that question of why ethics might need to be interlinked with religion. And that's what we might call a kind of basically divine command theory of morality. So the idea that that God is the source of moral requirements and perhaps even moral values more generally. And in the chapter, I just consider what's been called the Euthyphro dilemma for the divine command theory. And the Euthyphro dilemma is basically asking the question of whether the moral order is prior to God or whether God creates the moral order.
Yes.
So if the moral order is entirely created by God, then it seems at least logically possible that God could have created it differently. That, all the things that we think are morally evil, well, God could have made those things morally good or perhaps even required. And that seems like a very bad, that seems kind of unthinkable. I mean, I know that people say that, maybe God is beyond rational comprehension and so on, but even, I mean, I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that thought, but I think that is going too far. So that seems like a very bad result. But if you say, well, so that horn of the dilemma is unacceptable, then you go on to the other horn and then you say, well, so God didn't create morality. Morality's prior to God, and God in a way just has to act within the, God is perfectly just or perfectly good and so on. And that just means that God has to work within a kind of pre-existing framework. But then, perhaps you don't need to, there's a sense in which religion will be entangled with morality. Yes, of course, because, God is acting within this framework, but it's not that the framework, I mean, you could at least logically imagine that, it would be logically possible that the framework could exist without God. So in some sense, the validity of the framework doesn't seem to depend on God. So those are the kind of two horns of the dilemma, neither of them very happy for the divine command theorist. So then you have to think, well, am I going to abandon a divine command account? Does the dilemma give me good reason to abandon it, or can I refine it in such a way as to avoid the horns of the dilemma in some way?
Thank you so much. Professor, when we look at around the world, we see people, especially the young people, struggling with the meaning of life. And that's really important, especially for young people. In book, you talk about this issue. You talk about death and the meaning of life. You talk about which lives count. Please tell us about this issue.
Yes. So, sorry, what was the issue that you mentioned right at the end there? Can you repeat
Especially
that? Sorry.
meaning of life. Please tell us about what is the meaning of life.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to tell you what the meaning of life is, but what I do in the chapter is to look at really at the kinds of things that might seem to make it the case that life is meaningful. So I talk a bit about one theory of human motivation and what people want from life. And that's a kind of hedonistic theory, and the hedonistic theory says that really all we do is look for pleasure and so on. Well, the way I set things up is by talking about this example, and this is drawn from Albert Camus again, but the example of Sisyphus. So, I mean, Sisyphus is condemned to this absurd punishment of having to roll his rock to the top of the hill, at the top of the mountain, which is an intolerable kind of toil. And then when he gets to the top of the mountain, it rolls back down to the bottom, and he's just got to go do it all over again. And it's just this pointless kind of repetition of a very burdensome task. And that seems to be a good image of a meaningless life. But you might think that if life is only about pleasure, then in a way we're not too far from that ideal. You just you spend lots of time trying to get some pleasure. You have a bit of pleasure, then you're without pleasure again, and then you've got to do it all over again. It's just a bit of a kind of repetitive cycle. And so I think the chapter is really set up for thinking about how do you get out of that. If that's really the threat of meaninglessness, then how can you get out of that? And then it talks about how another way of looking at human life is that there are kind of meaningful activities or projects that that are more developmental. They're not just purely repetitive. So if you think about learning philosophy as a good example, or being in love with someone, or maintaining a friendship, or a family, or and so on, these things go through various developmental phases. There's all sorts of skills and abilities that you have to draw on, and resources and so on to try and make these things work. So you're always kind of being required to kind of live quite actively and so on in order to do these things, and to synthesize various human faculties and abilities. And that just seemed to me to be quite a good model of how life can be made up of meaningful activities, and perhaps that's a good picture or model of a meaningful life. But then having got there, I then consider things from the point of view of eternity, and that's what I call the Ozymandias problem. So so this is based on a poem by Shelley, an English language poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley. And Ozymandias, you come across this statue in the desert, and it's probably there's just fragments of it left, but you can tell that there was this mighty statue of Ozymandias, and now it's nothing. And Ozymandias was a great person, and perhaps did all sorts of meaningful things, but now is absolutely nothing. There's very little left to posterity, and I don't know. Does that mean that really our lives are meaningless? Because for any individual, certainly, maybe at the species level, we'll have made a mark on the planet, but for way after our deaths, for better or worse. But at any individual, looking at any individual, does that mean that no individual's life really makes much difference? Because because from the point of view of eternity, our posterity is going to be really, nothing much. So I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that does lead on to some interesting questions about how it might be the case that part of the meaning of our lives, at least, is based in our membership of collective projects that are going to last beyond our existence. And I think that is that. Yeah, I'm still a bit of a socialist. I still quite like collectivism and so on at some level. So I quite like the idea that that part of what makes our lives meaningful might be the success of these collective projects that we're involved in.
Thank you so much. And Professor, for 1,000 years, philosopher from Aristotle, Plato, talk about happiness, talk about well-being. I don't know what to say, daimonia, as Aristotle said. What is this thing called happiness or well-being? Please tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, I think since I think in Derek Parfit's kind of landmark book, Reasons and Persons, he made a distinction between three kind of theories of well-being. So basically, first of all, the hedonistic theory that I've mentioned previously, which is the idea that your well-being is basically pleasure, or your pleasure in the absence of pain. That's all that well-being amounts to. And then some people think, well, that's too simple in a way. You can get pleasures too easily, and so on, and then maybe you could have a kind of more sophisticated version of hedonism. But like John Stuart Mill has this idea of higher pleasures. But some people think you've just got to abandon hedonism. It's too simple. It's not no good. So two other alternatives that Parfit mentions. One is the kind of desire satisfaction theory of well-being. So on that view, your life is going well to the extent that you satisfy your desires, or perhaps satisfy your most important, strongest, or most central desires, or something. There are various ways to develop it. And then thirdly would be a kind of objective list view, is how Parfit calls it, which is the idea that there are just certain meaningful activities or goals or ends that that just are objectively what the human good consists in. So that might, pleasure might be one of those, but not the only one. Maybe we also have knowledge or friendship, or achievements of various sorts, and so on. So then you could have arguments in a way about what should be on that objective list, and sometimes so those are three theories, and I suppose sometimes when we're arguing about which of those theories is correct, then we are coming back to that earlier question of what makes a life meaningful. What is the connection between well-being and meaningfulness? So could your life be very happy and well-being, but yet totally meaningless? Or is it the case that really, in order to be having a life with well-being in it, then it also has to be meaningful? I mean, I kind of take it that the Aristotelian view is something more towards the objective, and that, I mean, Aristotle wasn't really thinking about meaningfulness in life. That's an interesting point, I think, historically. Probably someone should investigate the history of the idea of the meaningfulness of life. But I'm kind of thinking that his theory of welfare is something like a theory of meaning in a way. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Professor, one of the most important issue in ethics is relativism. There seems to be a desire among students around the world to accept relativism. What is your opinion on this? Please explain about moral relativism. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think that there are good reasons to push us in some direction of relativism, but I think some of those motivations for relativism are themselves moral, and so I think you end up affirming something like relativism, but on the basis of some kind of universal morality. So let me just explain what I mean by that. I mean, I think one of the very important things that has one of the very important changes in the way that we think is better understanding and more interest in alien cultures, so cultures that are not our own, and I think, you know, I mean, I'm just speculating here, but I think, you know, perhaps historically, part of the basis for that was coming to recognize that these were cultures who were created by, you know, people who were themselves God's creations and God's children in a way, and therefore had a kind of equal value in some sense with the people who, you know, were in the, you know, were in our culture, you know, so in a way, you know, you get a kind of universe, you know, a kind of, if you've got a monotheism which gives you a kind of idea of universal human worth because everyone is created by God, then, you know, that might push you in the direction of seeing even sort of strange looking cultures, you know, barbaric looking cultures as themselves being, you know, peopled by, you know, creatures of God and you know, created by God and so on. So I think you know, lots of people are not religious anymore, but I think that idea of kind of universal respect and respect for other cultures and so on, I think that's one of the motivations for relativism. But that's, of course, a very important moral principle, and I don't think people who want to be relativistic, you know, want to be relativistic about that principle. They don't want to say, oh well, yeah, if a culture doesn't agree that all cultures are to be respected, then, you know, fine. You know, I mean, they think that that's a kind of non-negotiable principle, that, you know, of respect for cultures. So I think in a way there's a kind of moral basis for a lot of the impulse towards relativism.
Thank you very much. And Professor, in your book, you talk about utilitarianism. Please tell us, please define for us this method in ethics, and then tell us about now, today, in the world, why utilitarianism is important still. Thank you.
Yeah, so utilitarianism has a very simple principle in a way, which is that in answer to any question where you may want to know what the right action to do is, or you know, what the right political institution to have, or whatever, the utilitarian answer just says that you should choose the one that is going to maximize happiness and minimize unhappiness, or maximize the balance of happiness over unhappiness. Nothing else matters. Okay, so just maximize happiness. Now, so I think a lot of people like that because it's a very simple answer, and in principle, that's something that you could perhaps work out. So you could imagine, here I am wondering whether to do this interview. I've had the invitation. I'm wondering whether to do it. I think, well, there are various things that I could do at 12 o'clock UK time on Tuesday. Let me set them all out, all the different alternatives. I should only do the interview if that's the option that is going to maximize happiness in the world. And in principle, perhaps that question does have an answer to it. So what I should do is to work out, all my options A, B, C, and D. Work out, how much happiness they're perhaps likely to cause, how much unhappiness, and then I go with the one that seems to promise to bring about the greatest good or happiness. So I think in a way that, that's very attractive. And part of its attractiveness is that it's just all about making the world a better place, making the world a better place for beings who have some kind of good, who have some kind of welfare or interests or something like that. So I think that's the core intuition of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, I suppose, is also a kind of egalitarian theory in principle, because it just takes everyone's welfare to matter. So when I'm working out which of my options will bring about the greatest happiness, I'm just thinking about the happiness of everyone who can have happiness, and in a way, everyone gets into that calculation and should be taken into account. So it's quite a good egalitarian theory, and obviously, it's an alternative to a divine command theory. You don't have to believe in God or have God there as an authority figure creating a moral order in order to think that what we do matters. Utilitarians say what we do matters just because it's got consequences. It's going to have either cause happiness or unhappinness, and you're the one who's got to decide which to do. So there's a very kind of nice and simple understanding of what our moral responsibilities are that in some way seems undeniable, even if you don't believe that there's a God or whatever. So,
Thank you very much. And the last question I want to ask you about this book, this question. In Kantian ethics, you talk about moral requirements as a requirement of rationality. Please tell us about this title. Thank you.
Yes. So I suppose the way we might understand Kant's view is as an attempt to do something that's a bit like a divine command theory, but without God, without the need for God, and so Kant disagrees with utilitarianism. Doesn't think that the utilitarianism is the correct approach, and one reason for that is that utilitarianism won't necessarily tell you that certain actions are always wrong. For utilitarianism, it might turn out that lying to someone, or perhaps even torturing them, or committing sexual violence and so on, these kinds of things could be the things that will bring about the greatest overall happiness in some way. I mean, perhaps that's possible. So Kant is kind of revolted by that thought and wants the idea that certain actions are totally to be ruled out. And one way that you could get that is by having a divine authority rule those things out entirely. But Kant doesn't think that you can know about God. I mean, he does believe in God, but doesn't think you can know God's nature. So Kant's ingenious in a way solution to this problem is to say, well, we have got a source of requirement, and that's kind of rational requirement. We're rational beings, and rationality brings with it a kind of constraint. So, you know, if you're a rational being, for instance, you know, perhaps you can't hold two contradictory beliefs or something. So you can't believe P and not P, or something like that. You know, and then perhaps there are also requirements of practical rationality. So when it comes to action, you know, perhaps it's just irrational to you know, to undercut your own purposes, for instance. So I want to get to the train station in order to, you know, to go and give a lecture in London or something, and I just don't take the steps necessary to get to the train station, and I defeat my own purposes. That just seems irrational, and it seems that there is a kind of requirement on me, at least, you know, if I'm going to have purposes, to take the means necessary for my purposes. And so Kant's great idea is to say, well, look, morality is a rational requirement like that. And so his idea is that morality has to be a kind of universal law. And it's only if you can will something as a universal law that well, it's only if you can will something as a universal law that, rationally speaking, you can do that thing. So you're constrained by universal law, and Kant thinks that that's part of the very nature of practical rationality. So it's an ingenious idea. You know, I think probably there's a minority of people who think that it actually works, but it's an incredibly interesting idea, and yeah, I would recommend reading Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals to anyone who really, you know, I doubt that everyone agrees with its conclusions, but you know, really an amazing work of philosophy.
Thank you so much. And Professor, speak of rationality. If may, please tell us about the place of rationality in the whole of ethics, and is morality necessarily rational?
Yes, well, that's a good question. I mean, so there are people like Kant who think that morality is a matter of rationality, and also that it's a matter of the kind of rationality that we might share, you know, with all rational beings, whether they are like us, human beings, embodied, have emotions, and so on. So you know, even angels, even, you know, the divine figure himself, you know, may also have this kind of rationality, basically. So and I think a lot of people think that you know, there might be some kind of emotional basis. You know, they might disagree with Kant and think that, you know, no, there's got to be some kind of emotional basis to morality. That somehow morality is the way that the world looks from our perspective. You know, given that we are embodied creatures with certain needs, but also certain kind of emotions and forms of receptivity and so on. And that you can't really explain, you know, at least some of morality, like, you know, compassion and so on, and you know, without appealing to capacities for sympathy and empathy and so on. You know, so I'm kind of I'm quite interested in the entanglement of ethics and emotions. So put it that way. However, I think it's a further question how rational emotions are. So, you know, that's another interesting question. Are emotions separate from rationality? You know, are they just? I think, you know, as as Kant probably seems to have thought, that you just have your rational side and your animal side, and the emotions are just in your animal side, and really that's not very sophisticated at all. Or is it the case that perhaps emotions have their own kind of rationality? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And another book I want to share with you, this book. Professor, first of all, please tell us about this book and the story behind of writing this book. Thank you.
Yeah, so this book is, as it says, a theory of punishment, and the idea of this book is that I'm interested in this question of whether we should have a system of punishment in a society, whether a good society would have a system of punishment, and what its meaning and basis might be. And as I mentioned earlier, part of my interest in this question is just because I'm really unsure as to what to think about it. So, I think, global peace is a very good idea. Nothing much more to be said about it. Peace is very good. And someone should just try and go on and work out how we get to, how we find peace and so on. Social justice, similarly, I mean, these are interesting questions, but not as intriguing as the question of punishment, because it just seems clear that social justice is an important thing, whereas punishment and the idea of retributive justice in particular seems very controversial. And even though I've kind of been working on it for a long time, and in some sense have tried to defend the idea, I can't say that I feel that I've totally got to the bottom of it. So that's part of the the basis of it. But I suppose one of the things that I was interested in, and one of the reasons that I'm not able to totally reject punishment and retribution, is the importance that I give to apology. And the kind of emotional states that lie behind apologizing. So it seems that even if someone might want to reject the idea of punishment and retribution, they shouldn't reject the idea that someone who does wrong has put themselves into a kind of new moral position where now they ought to apologize and need to do something to kind of rehabilitate themselves or redeem themselves. And then that's really what I made the heart of the account of punishment in the book. So I was trying to look at what the basis of some kind of moral responsibility is. Why is it the case that we end up in this moral position where we do owe an apology? What are apologies, and how do they work? What kind of work do they do in redeeming someone? And then finally, what would punishment look like if you made apology its main focus? So that's why the theory of punishment ends up being called the apology ritual. So it really is a kind of a theory of punishment, because the idea basically is that that someone who commits a crime is required to do the kind of thing that they would find it necessary to do by way of apology if they were properly sorry for what they'd done. And that's the punishment then. It's being made to do that kind of thing. So being made to do the kind of thing that you should apologetically do. That's the basic idea in the book. Or towards the end of the book. I mean, the book kind of runs up to the development of that idea. So that's what I try to argue for in the book. I mean, one of the reasons that I've kept on working in these kinds of areas is just that it seems to me that the philosophy of punishment is just an issue where lots of very important philosophical themes intersect. So themes about moral responsibility and free will, you know, the nature of things like apology and so on, the emotions and the role of emotions in morality, but also political questions about what the role of the state is and whether the state should be doing these things like making people apologize and so on, and what the authority of the state is. Yeah, and I've just kept on kind of working on themes like this since publishing the book, probably because I felt that I hadn't got to the bottom of them in writing the book. So there's still more to say about these things.
Thank you so much. Professor Bennett, as you said, in this book, we faced with a lot of issues like problem of punishment, justice, responsibility, and a lot of things. First of all, I want to ask you about the relationship between philosophy of ethics and philosophy of law. Please tell us about this relationship.
Yes, I mean, yes, that's a good question. I mean, I think when we're thinking about philosophy of law, then, you know, we can clearly be thinking about philosophy of law as a branch of normative theory. So normative theory just means that you know, we can think about it in terms of, you know, having to make choices where we can get it right or wrong, or where there might be some norms governing, you know, what the right choices are. So we can have the right laws or the wrong laws, and we can have the right legal institutions and procedures or the wrong ones, and so on. So to some extent, that's, you know, clearly falls under normative theory. And if you want to call ethics just normative theory in general, then philosophy of law is clearly a branch of ethics in that sense. However, I think there's a good case probably for saying that philosophy of law is also, you know, really a branch of political philosophy, and that it needs to be thought of in terms of a general theory of the authority of the state and of, you know, what the main aims of the state ought to be. So, and that might just lead you to make a bit of a distinction between kind of interpersonal morality, so the morality that governs relations between individuals. You know, maybe if I wrong you or I forget about our meeting or something like that, then I should apologize to you. You know, and maybe that's an important part of interpersonal morality. But it might be quite a separate question whether that should be part of it, as it were, our political morality, or the values that should govern our political decisions and so on. So, and I suppose I'm sympathetic to the idea that there are different spheres there. However, I do think that an important theme is the possibility of matching these two spheres up a bit, at least, and that it's important in order for us to be able to identify with political authorities that some of the things that they do connect with interpersonal morality. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was interested in this apology ritual idea, that, you know, if we could see something that's as intuitive in interpersonal terms as apology being kind of, you know, repeated at the institutional level, then, you know, that might in a way be an important aspect of the legitimacy of the of those institutions. So that was a theme that I explored a bit in the book as well.
Thank you very much. And if may, please tell us briefly about the theories of punishment and the alternatives to punishment.
So so in the book, I'm interested in particular in an alternative to punishment called restorative justice. Now, I mean, this is all, in a way, a bit society specific. But countries like the UK and the US have quite formal procedures for trial and punishment, and they tend to not involve victims and not to involve face-to-face dealings between victims and alleged offenders. So one of the things that restorative justice does is it can involve a kind of meeting between victims and offenders, I explain here the restorative alternative as a way of trying to recover the important meaning of responses to wrongdoing, so that it just doesn't become a kind of technical matter of behavior control or something, but that it actually connects with our kind of understandings of the meaning of wrongdoing. So I was interested in restorative justice as a way of as an alternative to punishment, partly as an alternative to very formal kind of ways of dealing with crime. And really what I do in the book is to try to synthesize these two extremes and find a middle way that might be more acceptable. So I, in the end, reject the restorative alternative. I don't think that that's quite the right way to go, partly because it just gives too much discretion to the victim and the offender participating in this meeting. So I think that you do need some kind of state involvement, but on the other hand, you need state involvement that continues to connect with the meaningful understandings of how to respond to wrongdoing that we have in interpersonal life. And that, so as a result, I give my apology ritual account, which is meant to be in a way the best of both worlds. So that's the idea of the overall argument.
Thank you so much. And for the last question in this interview, I want to ask you about this title, Institutional Blame and Apology. Please tell us about it.
Yeah, so here the idea is that what I've done previously in the book is to look at the level of interpersonal morality, at this what I call a kind of cycle of wrongdoing and redemption. So you might wrong someone, and as a result, kind of put yourself in this, distinctive moral position of needing to make amends. And perhaps you do then make amends, and as a result, you redeem yourself and you kind of return to the community and so on. And I think that that's not a bad description of how things work at the interpersonal level. But as I've said, I recognize that the institutional level or the political level might be different. We might have to think about that differently. And so this chapter is really an attempt to say that or to argue that that interpersonal perspective and the notions of moral community and that kind of cycle of wrongdoing and redemption, that those kinds of things can be relevant to modern political community, even political community which is made up of very diverse people, and also I suppose I'm writing from the point of view of a kind of liberal community, or a community that values in some way and prioritizes in some way the value of individual freedom and autonomy. So again, I kind of say that that it can make sense to think of the political society as a kind of community, a community of values, from which you alienate yourself by committing crime, and from which you can return by making an appropriate apology. And so for that reason, the apology ritual account of punishment does kind of fit even a kind of modern political society. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just a little question, because you know a lot of things about punishment and Kant. I want to ask you about the Kant's view on punishment.
Yes, I mean, so Kant has various, he writes about punishment in various different places, and in a way, Kant might well think that the ethics of punishment is quite different from punishment as a question in political philosophy.
Yes.
But some of Kant's remarks, for instance, in the Metaphysics of Morals, or the doctrine of justice and the doctrine of virtue. Yes. So there, he's kind of thinking about this case where, imagine that you've got a kind of island community which is disbanding. You've got some murderers who are in prison, and he says, before you disband, you have to execute those murderers, because if not, then blood guilt will cling to you. That seems like a very extreme point of view, and a very extreme kind of retributive point of view. So it's the idea that doing retribution really is a duty, and a very important duty, and that if you don't comply with that duty to do retribution, then there are very serious moral consequences, blood guilt, and so on. In other places in Kant's writing, he seems a bit less retributivist, and he seems more interested in the idea that what an institution of punishment is there for in a society really is a kind of deterrence or something, or to give people an incentive, not to commit crimes. And the other thing that Kant is in a way known for is for a defense of a kind of lex talionis idea, the idea that punishment in a way has to take the form of the crime in some way, and has to kind of replicate the crime in what gets done to the offender. So I mean, I'm not totally sure how to make Kant's view coherent, but I know attempts have been made to do that, and so on. And I suppose different people will perhaps, as in in the case of these great thinkers who perhaps aren't always totally coherent, people will take the things that they think are most suggestive or fertile and try to develop them. I mean, I've been quite interested in that thought about blood guilt and so on, and the Highland case, just because it seems such a a bizarre idea. On the other hand, is there a kernel of truth in it? And I think there is something to be said about complicity and how complicity in wrongdoing might arise if you don't react in the right way to the wrongdoing. So I think that is perhaps a defensible version of Kant's thesis there. And that's one of the things that I've been exploring a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Professor Bennett, thank you so much for joining me in this interview. I'm really appreciated. I learned a lot of things from you, and that's the enjoyable interview for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for your great questions. It's been very pleasurable.
By the way, what do you think about philosophy in Iran?
Yeah, so unfortunately, because of the relations between our countries and so on, I don't know, I don't have a lot of interaction with Iranian philosophy and philosophers. But as it happens, when I was earlier in my career, there was an Iranian philosophy student who studied at Sheffield, and I was the examiner on their thesis, and they were working on kind of issues about what morality is and the rationality of morality in its objective existence and so on. And I got a very favourable impression of the standard of philosophy from there, but I suppose more generally, Iran is obviously a country with a very rich intellectual heritage, and I think one of the unfortunate things in Western philosophy at the moment is a bit of a neglect of the Islamic tradition, generally speaking. The Islamic tradition was clearly, absolutely central in bridging, in a way, even from the perspective of Western philosophy, from bridging between classical philosophy and modern philosophy. And some of the only ways in which classical philosophy survived was through Muslim commentators and so on. So I think there's lots of reasons for Western philosophers to explore that tradition.
That's great.
So I've probably said enough, but yes, I've very favorable impressions. Yeah.
As you said, and as you know, we had a great tradition in Islamic philosophy, like Avicenna, Al-Farabi, and a bunch of great philosophers. But now, today, in Department of Philosophy, for example, in Tehran University, contemporary philosophy is very popular and important for students. For example, Wittgenstein now is very important for Iranian professor and Iranian students. And philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, ethics philosophy. But there's a problem. Sometimes some students just read a translated book. And that's why I decided to connect with another professor around the world to see another's view. And when you accept my request to be in this interview, that's a lot of means to me. Thank you so much, Professor.
No, well, thank you very much for asking me, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you very much. And I really like the idea of your projects of trying to build these build these bridges and keep the communication going. So I really hope that this has been helpful. But thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless you, and goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.